we're going live. Good Tavach, Shavua Tov. Welcome, everybody. Another week of some amazing teachings. So today is Yudalid Iyar, 14th day of the month of Iyar. It is Pesach Sheni, the second Pesach. And as the previous Rebbe said, as Nitokin Farfale, there's never a lost hope, lost opportunity. We can always make good. And as a result, in a certain way, Pesach Sheni is even greater. Is even greater than the first Pesach. We make a big hoo-ha about the first Pesach, right? And this one is kind of like, but this one fixes that which needs mending of the first one. If you didn't bring the sacrifice the first time, so you bring it here the second time, that you can fill that the gap that you left the first Pesach. You can fill that gap now. So in that sense, filling the gap of what was lacking is greater now, because we have that opportunity, we can do that, than the original Pesach. In a certain sense, it's greater. Okay. Did you ever ask yourself, when you engage in doing a mitzvah, what's the most important part of the mitzvah? The details of the mitzvah, or what the mitzvah is trying to imbue upon us? Right? Is it when you light Friday night candles, is the most important thing the details and how you are doing it, before Shabbos, before sunset, 18 minutes before sunset? There's different laws about what kind of candles you can use and so on and so forth. Or is it more the message? Same thing with tefillin. Tefillin, there's a lot of details that you can get lost in the details of the mitzvah. So sometimes you might get lost in all of the details and you forget the message. The message of binding yourself with your mind and your heart to Hashem. So we need to understand and appreciate this and understand this better, because after all, we engage in mitzvahs. So we want to make sure we engage as best as possible. So let us share. We will do, and then we will understand, right? Is the doing so we come to understand? So there's the question over here. Do you ever wonder why Judaism focuses so much on the details? If we spend so much time on the technicalities, don't we lose the bigger picture? So we'll explain this at the end of the class. Meantime, we're going to start the beginning of the parsha. Parshah Behar, which means on the mountain, speaks about Shemitah, the sabbatical year, that every 7 years, every 7 years, we're obliged to leave not one piece of land fallow, but all the lands fallow at the same time, right? Not one this year, one next year, over 7 years. No, all the lands of everybody, the land will be fallow. Let's take a look in the parsha in front of us, the beginning of the parsha. So it reads as following: And God spoke to Moshe at Mount Sinai, saying, speak to the children of Israel, and you shall say to them, when you come to the land that I am giving you, the land shall rest on the Sabbath to God. You may sow your field for 6 years, and for 6 years you may prune your vineyard and gather in its produce. But in the 7th year, the land shall have a complete rest, a Sabbath to God, and you shall not sow your field, nor shall you prune your vineyard. You shall not reap the aftergrowth of your harvest, even things that are, that you didn't plant, but they are just, wildly. You shall not pick the grapes that you had set aside for yourself, for it shall be a year of rest for the land. And the produce of the Sabbath of the land shall be yours to eat for you, for your male and female slaves, and for your hired worker and resident who live with you, as you all have it equal, that you can partake in it. And all of its produce may be eaten also by the domestic animals and by the beasts that are in your land. Well, we learned this today in Chumash and Rashi. We went into great length explaining. So we're going to quote one Rashi to get some understanding. Because what do we say over here that's something unusual? We always say God spoke to Moses saying, but here it's on Mount Sinai. Why? Why does it say on Mount Sinai? That is not an expression that's normally used. What is the point of that? It's extra words, seemingly. So Rashi says, right? He says the following. On Mount Sinai, what special relevance does the subject of Shemitah have to Mount Sinai? Were not all of the commandments stated from Sinai? Right? All the commandments. So this teaches us that just as with Shemitah, its general principles and its finer details were all stated from Sinai, likewise, so too it is with every mitzvah. Their general principles were stated together with their finer details at Sinai. And why is Shemitah used the example to prove this rule? Right? Why is it Shemitah, the sabbatical year, proving this rule? Now, what do we say? What is Rashi saying? That every mitzvah that we have in the Torah, at Sinai, given to Moses, was the general principle and all the finer details. So now why is Shemitah the one mitzvah that it says Bahar Sinai and Mount Sinai to bring out that all of the general principles and the details were given at Mount Sinai? Why particularly this? To prove the rule. The explanation is, unlike other mitzvahs, we do not find the laws of Shemitah reiterated on the plains of Moab in Deuteronomy. Thus, we are compelled to say that its general principles, finer details, and explanations were all stated at Sinai. When we come to the book of Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy means second teachings. Mishnah Torah, as it's called, as Rambam calls Mishnah Torah, means like the second teachings, the second book after. So also it's called Mishnah Torah, meaning the second teachings. Why? Because many of the mitzvahs that were reiterated earlier in the Torah are now mentioned again with some more details, some more nuances, and so on. Except for the mitzvah of Shemitah, of the sabbatical year, that is not mentioned again in the book of Deuteronomy. So therefore, it has to tell us, you might think that only those things that are in Deuteronomy, those are repeated, being repeated in the book of Deuteronomy that were first said at Mount Sinai, but sabbatical year wasn't said at Mount Sinai. Right? It was told later in the journey of the Jewish people, right, in the 40 years of the desert. So this in turn tells us that so the answer is no. This too was told us at Sinai. How? Like every other mitzvah, with the general principles and its details and finer details. So this in turn tells us that every mitzvah that was conveyed to Moshe from Sinai, including their general principles and finer details, and the commandments delineated in Deuteronomy were merely repeated and reviewed on the plains of Moab, but not originally given there. They weren't given there, they were given at Sinai. Just like these were given at Sinai, that the Torah has to clearly delineate that and tell us that. So likewise, all of the Torah mitzvahs that were given at Sinai, that were repeated in the book of Deuteronomy, in the Mishnah Torah and Dvarim, are also given at Sinai with the general principles and their finer details. Okay, is that clear? Now, what do we mean about general principle and finer details? What does that mean exactly? So mitzvahs can be divided into two parts. There's the main theme and the function of the mitzvah. And then there's the details on how it ought to be performed. So, for example, shofar, right? What's the main function of the shofar? Is to hear the blast of the shofar, right? The mitzvah is lishmaya kol shofar, to hear the blast of the shofar. So that's the general principle. Now, there are intricate details that go with that. In other words, the shofar has to have a minimum size. It has to be without holes on, holes in it that air might escape. It has to be a particular animal's horn. There's a minimum amount of sounds and three different types of sounds that you need to make. And the list goes on. And someone who blows a shofar in a synagogue before the holidays goes through all the finer details to make sure that they have everything quite clear in how to do it. But it's the how-to. It's the how-to in order that the function of hearing the shofar, which is the main function, the main purpose of the mitzvah, should be accomplished. Now, so Rashi is telling us here that just like Shemitah was given on Mount Sinai, the law, not just the general principles, but all of the relevant details, so too every mitzvah, all of the general principles, like we just had here with the general principle of the mitzvah, like shofar, hearing the shofar, and it's all finer details on how that's done, was given at Sinai, not at a later date. That's what Rashi's come to tell us. Is that clear? Any questions on that? Okay. As questions only for clarity's sake. In other words, if you don't have a clarity in what we just said. Okay, great. Okay, great that you got it. But so what? Why does that matter? What's the difference if the mitzvahs were delivered at Sinai or later on? I mean, the bottom line, God gave the mitzvahs. Whether God gave the mitzvah shofar at Mount Sinai or he gave it later on, he gave it. So it's a mitzvah to fulfill. What is the point over here? That's one question. It's rhetorical questions, by the way. Furthermore, why is Shemitah, the sabbatical year, the chosen mitzvah to bring out this idea? It's not random. Okay, so Rashi explained, because the other mitzvahs are told in Deuteronomy, repeated in Deuteronomy, where Shemitah isn't. Okay, so it could have been repeated in Deuteronomy, In other words, there must be a thematic connection to what we're trying to bring across over here, which we don't know yet because we've just asked the question, right?
Because it's a finer detail, and as the inverse, the finer details gets only explained at this point.
No, that's exactly what Rashi is saying. The opposite. He's saying all the finer details were given at Sinai.
But it's only gets only written at this point. It's all comes from Sinai, but it's gets only written at one specific passage.
I'm not clear what that has to do with my question. Our question is, what's the difference if it was given? The first question was, what's the difference if it was given at Sinai or given another time? God gave it. God gave the mitzvah. What relevance does that have? That's the first question. Second question is, if we're learning this principle, that all of the themes and the general principles and the finer details were all given at Sinai, just like Shemitah was, all other mitzvahs are. Why is it Shemitah, the sabbatical year, is the vehicle that we learn out to all other mitzvahs? There must be something about that mitzvah that, right, is thematic, right, in the content of the mitzvah, that it will teach us about every other mitzvah. I didn't give an answer, but I just hope that the question is clear. And finally, getting back to our original question, there's so much detail. We've been learning Rambam for a year. There's so much detail. And even in after the Rambam's teachings, there's so many more details. It's so easy to get lost in the minutia. And then sometimes you don't, you get lost in the leaf and you don't notice there's a forest. And for the average person, it might be very tedious, all of the details. So how do we understand that and how do we deal with that? That's the question. Okay. Are we clear on what's going on here? I want to make sure because I think there might be some confusion. Should I repeat repeat this again to bring clarity? Yeah? Ahuva? No, you're good? Yep. Okay. Andrew, you're good. Leslie? Okay. Okay, excellent. Okay. All right. Let's look at some of the mitzvahs that have to do with Shemitah, with the sabbatical year. So there's a negative and a positive commandment. A negative is a lav, and a positive is an asay. What's the negative commandment? It's a prohibition: do not work the land on the seventh year. Don't work the land, right? We read that in the beginning, right? But there's a positive commandment. What is that? To leave the land to rest, right? To go fallow. So the obvious question, what is the point of the additional positive mitzvah? I mean, who's the Torah talking to when it's giving an additional mitzvah of leave the land to rest? I mean, if the same person who was told not to work the land isn't working the land, isn't it then as a matter of fact, that the land is fallow and is resting? Right? So if you have the prohibition, what's the point of the positive commandment? Right? What does it add? What does it add? Huh?
Faith in God.
No, that's no.
Because these were farmers back then, telling them you're going to stop working and you're not going to, God will provide in essence, and you're not going to.
But what you're saying is true about faith in God, but that's not the focus in the mitzvah here, right?
Well, the positive thing is you have faith in God.
But that's not what I'm saying. No, that's not. Yeah, you're right, but that's not the mitzvah. You're making your own mitzvah now. That's not what it says. It's a positive commandment to leave the land rest. If you're not going to till the soil, if you're not going to sow the soil, right? So then of course the land is going to be laid to rest, right? So what are you adding? It's not adding anything. And it's not saying have faith. That's a separate, you're right about what you're saying to have faith, but that's not the point of the mitzvah. I mean, that's not the function of the mitzvah. The function of the mitzvah is what? Exactly. So we're going to get a little Talmudic over here. If you have your Talmudic caps, you can put them on. So there's a very interesting concept. We've had it before. Is how do you look at something? You could look at something, what we call gavra and chefza. You could look at the mitzvah relative to the person, or you could look at relative to the object. So let me explain. If you look that there's a positive commandment that you should leave the land to rest, right? And you look at it that is a commandment to the person, right? Commanding a person to do that, then essentially what we have now is that the landowner has a negative commandment not to work the land and a positive commandment that he must make it rest, right? So it's on the person, two commandments, positive and negative. And therefore there's a duplication. There's a duplication here. A duplication because if you have the negative commandment that you're not allowed to work the land, then of course the land is going to be resting. But you have a double commandment. So it could be just a greater emphasis of the importance of this command, but it is it's a double on the same person, right? But if you look at the mitzvah here on the chefza, which means on the object, what's the object in discussion over here? Anybody?
The land.
The land, right? So it's not about you as the owner of the land that you should leave it to rest. It's that the land needs to be resting. In other words, you're the steward of the land, you're the landowner. You must ensure that it's not plowed, planted, pruned, or harvested, right? If it's a mitzvah only on me, that I shouldn't do it as a landowner, right? So then I just have a double mitzvah. But here, if I'm a steward, I have to make sure what? That there should be no one working the land, right? Because the command is about the land, not about, me vis-a-vis the land, right? But it's about the land that it should not be worked, right? So what would the legal ramification be of that? I hinted a bit to it. If it's only about me,
You would be sued for the damage because we're just the caretaker. So if we damage the land by not doing the positive aspects of it, God could sue us.
okay, let's put it in other terms. Good. If it's about me that I should not work the land as the owner of this piece of land, and I have upon me the commandment to allow the land to rest, what happens if I hire out my land to a non-Jew who is not commanded in any of this? So seemingly, according to this, the non-Jew could work the land, right?
But the land won't heal.
Again,
I don't know.
if the obligation is only upon me as a person, right? We're splitting a hair over here. So just understand the split of the hair first before you, to make sure you get that distinction. The Torah is coming to say, I shouldn't do it, but that doesn't mean someone else can't do it, right? Doesn't mean someone else can't. So by contrast, though, if the mitzvah is not upon me, but the object of the land that it needs to rest, and me being a steward of the land, then I have an obligation then to make sure that a non-Jew that I wouldn't hire it out to a non-Jew, that they would work the land. Get the distinction? Let's see how the Rabbi explains it in this week's Parsha, in this week's Sikha, in the Parsha. One of the practical differences this distinction would make, if the mitzvah is that a Jew's land should be left alone, untouched in the sabbatical year, then it makes no difference who it is to blame for violating this restraining order, regardless of who does the work on the Jewish-owned land, even if it is what was done by a non-Jew, by a Gentile. The landowner is liable for violating the positive commandment, the positive mitzvah, because it's not a commandment that he shouldn't do it. It's a commandment that the land has to rest. And he's the steward of the land because he's the owner of the land, so he has to make sure, right? However, if the mitzvah is addressed to the person, right, then when a Gentile works the field, the landowner is not considered to have violated the mitzvah. He has violated the mitzvah, right? Because the mitzvah is upon him. Well, he's not doing it. So he hasn't violated the mitzvah. Is that clear? So this positive commandment, now we need to understand, is it a command to the person, meaning the landowner, or is it a command about the land itself that as a steward of the land, right, as the landlord of the land, I have a responsibility to make sure that it would not be, nothing would be done on the land, okay? Let's put this question on hold for a moment, and let's look at a second positive mitzvah that also has to do with the sabbatical year. And that is that and we learned that in the very first verse, all of the land, that is one thing, you're not allowed to work the land, but the second thing is that it's free. The land is free for all to take the produce.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
isn't there, I don't know if it was a midrash, but isn't it something to the effect when we were at the time finally take the land from the Canaanites, it was because God had in essence allowed the Canaanites there, and by their the bad things they did in Canaan, they lost their, in essence, they were the stewardesses of the land,
Right. Exactly.
and they lost their
Right.
rights to be the stewardess based upon their actions.
Right. Exactly. Yes. Right. But now we're talking about, the Jewish people being the stewards of the land that they're going to get when they come into the land of Israel, right? So what does it say here? But on the seventh year, you shall release it and abandon it. The poor of your people shall eat it, and what they leave over, the beasts of the field shall eat it. So shall you do to your vineyard and to your olive trees. More specifically, the Rambam says, it is a positive commandment to divest oneself from everything that the land produces in the sabbatical year. Anyone who locks his vineyard or fences off his field in the sabbatical year has nullified a positive commandment. This holds true if he gathered all the produce into his home, right? Because what's he doing in effect? Keeping it all for himself. It's ownerless, this produce in the seventh year. Instead, he should leave everything ownerless. Thus, everyone has equal rights in every place, as the verse states, and the poor of your people shall eat it. Now, here's the same question. Is this positive commandment a commandment on the person, right? Which means, therefore, the person has to actively declare that the fruit is ownerless, or it's not. It's on the object. The object of anything that grows in the seventh year automatically becomes ownerless, whether you make it ownerless or not, right? So what does that mean? Practically speaking, does the owner of the of anything that grows on that year, right? Anything that grows that year and is growing wild because he didn't sow the land, but things do grow, right? Do I have to actively make a statement that it is ownerless, or is it Torah making the object in discussion automatically ownerless? Is that clear? Now, it may seem like a semantics, but there's a practical legal difference over here. As we see from the Minchas Chinuch, one way of understanding the mitzvah is that it's addressed to the person, namely the Torah commands the landowner to declare his produce ownerless in the seventh year. Thus, if he declares it ownerless, it is indeed is. But if he doesn't, then it's not ownerless. Another, he transgressed a positive commandment to make it ownerless. But in fact, it's not ownerless until he makes it ownerless. Right? Transgress he did, but, right? While he is still considered to be in violation of the mitzvah, he is in violation of the mitzvah, that's for sure. The produce nevertheless belongs to him, and it's not up for grabs. As such, anyone who helps himself for two goods is stealing because the owner did not make it ownerless. Or perhaps that's one way to look at it. Or perhaps maybe the rule of ownerless produce doesn't imply that the owner has to do anything to make it ownerless, but rather everything becomes ownerless automatically by divine decree. The only way the owner can violate this is if he actively locks the gates of the field and the vineyard. Then right? It's still ownerless. Accordingly, if someone were to take the produce against the will of the owner, it would certainly belong to him. Why? Because it's ownerless. Because the Torah decreed it to be ownerless. Is that clear? So again, there's a positive commandment that you have to make everything ownerless? Is the commandment on a person, or is the commandment? The truth is, I don't understand if it's a positive commandment. How can not be on a person? Oh, so what would be the commandment if it's on the person? So that means he has to act, he has to declare it ownerless, right? And then he fulfills the commandment. Now, if it's on the object and it's automatic, so then how's he fulfilling the positive commandment? How? By not bringing it into his house, by not locking up the door so no one can come and take it. But in fact, it is ownerless nonetheless, right? Is that clear, the distinction? So this is complex hair splitting, and we see practical differences over here. The Rebbe in the Sikha argues in favor of Gavra approach, that the owner is commanded to disown his or her produce. That's the approach that he takes, right? So we went through a real analytical, mental roller coaster over here. But this only reinforces our earlier question. Why the focus on details so much? Like, they got so focused on details here that sometimes we're missing the broader picture. Why am I making your head spin over here that some of you maybe don't even follow what's going on? Precisely. So this is what we need to understand. Chanel, go ahead.
What's the point of making it ownerless, like in terms of the legal part? If you steal from them, what happens? Like, why? What changes about the land?
Well, the purpose of ownerless is that everybody has equal opportunity to it. The poor, you, anybody else, right? That's the point. Remember, you're not making any produce that year, so there's going to be a lot less produce naturally, right? Naturally, there's going to be a lot less produce. So you're going to want to hoard it. So you're going to have it for yourself because it's on your property. So the Torah says no. Whether you have to make it ownerless or it becomes automatically ownerless is our question, right? Was the question on how we look at that, right? But the fact is, the Torah says very clearly that it's equal, everybody has equal opportunity to it. Even it's on your property. We're talking about food on your property, right? You had tomatoes that grew on your property. Not because you sowed it, because you're not allowed to do that, right? But whatever grew wild or whatever, or things grow naturally every year, come back, an apple tree, right? You don't have to do much for an apple tree. So you might hoard all of it so you can make applesauce for your family. And no, the Torah says, no, it's ownerless. Now you have access to it just like anybody else, but it's not yours. That's what the Torah is saying. That's clear. Okay. So again, I just put you through a roller coaster over here, and I hope your minds are not numb, and you followed the idea of Gavra and Chefsa, of whether it's the mitzvah is on the person or the mitzvah is on the object. Of course, vis-a-vis the person, because mitzvah, there's no objects don't have mitzvahs. People have it, but what's the emphasis? Is it on the object versus solely on the person? So we got caught in a lot of minutia, a lot of detail on how to hair splitting arguments and how to see things. And sometimes, the broader picture we're missing. Like here in this instance, like you brought up, what's going on over here? Well, the broader picture is that it's ownerless because everybody has an equality. It's like it's like real socialism. Every 7 years, socialism, or not even socialism. It's even more than communism. Communism, you still have your part, right? Your things. Here, it's not even yours. It's ownerless. And as Andrew says, and we're not going to go there today because we're off on a different tangent over here, is ultimately, have trust and faith in God. That God is the one that provides your sustenance. And therefore, you can make it ownerless. You can not sow the field trusting that God will provide for you. That's an overreaching and overarching theme that is, I think, in tomorrow's Chumash Rashi. I don't know if it's tomorrow or the day after. I don't remember now, but that will be brought out in the parsha. Absolutely, no question. But that's not what we're going over here. We're going into the details over here, right? Because we started off that Behar Sinai, this law was told for what reason? To tell us that all of the general principles and themes and the finer details were all given at Mount Sinai, which we need to understand. So, okay, fine. And why particularly this mitzvah is the vehicle to teach to all other mitzvahs that they were also all told at Mount Sinai in their general principles and their finer details. Okay, so I know that, but like, what's the difference? I mean, we know it comes from God, and that's what's important. What is there must be a much more important message that it's coming to tell us here. And then this, roller coaster I just took you through of hair splitting argument of, you're looking at the mitzvah that it's incumbent upon the person, or it's incumbent upon the object, the land itself, right? Or the produce itself, that it's ownerless. And as we gave the different arguments, okay? So we need to understand all this. So, we're doing some renovations in our home, and it's interesting when you have something new. What happens? That's a minor, not major, but what happens when you have something new? So you're inspecting it that it's perfect. Like someone got a brand new car. So the tile that's put in. The tile that's put in the bathroom, is it precise? Is it, done well? Is there something wrong with the tile that it makes it? So I'm looking at the tile, and it says, "Oh, it looks like it's split. Like, it looks like it's got like some, like it's split or something." Then I look at a different angle, say, "No, that's actually the part of the tile, the way it." The way it was made, right? So some tiles are not just flat; they got a little bump to it or whatever. So I looked at it from a different angle and I saw it differently. But likewise over here, we need a tiny shift in perspective. And what's going to happen is we're going to see things in a totally new light. Just like I saw that tile, right? From one perspective, it looked like, oh my gosh, it looks like it's split or something wrong with it. From a different perspective, it's totally fine. So, from a conventional understanding, details of a mitzvah, what is the practical part of the mitzvah, right? It's the guidelines. It determines what you're supposed to do, right? So let's take tefillin. Without the details, you wouldn't know what you're supposed to do. Put it on your arm. You're supposed to put it on your forearm. You're supposed to put it on your bicep. It's against your heart, So there's a lot of halachas, a lot of law, for example, when it comes to the mitzvah and how it's supposed to be done, right? But the basic idea of tefillin is about, your connection with Hashem. It's against your head and against your heart. Right, the theme, the general principle is about being bound up with God, with your mind having dominion over your heart, something that we learn at great length in Tanya, in the first part of Tanya, right? So many halachas, right, that are to be practiced in order to do the mitzvah. So how do we understand those details, though? What's crucial? The overarching theme? The general principle? How about the details? How do we understand the overall details? So the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim, the guide for the perplexed, he gives there an interesting idea that the notion of divine reasoning is limited to the overall mitzvah, but not necessarily to the finer details. Rambam, I will now tell you what an intelligent person ought to believe in this respect, namely that each commandment has necessarily a cause as far as its general character is concerned. Like tefillah, I said, right? Of connecting the mind and the heart together in service of God, and serves a certain objective. But as regard its details, we hold that it has no ulterior object. So what's the Rambam saying over here? He's saying the general theme is the most important part, right? The details, the nitty-gritty details are, not as crucial. So he gives an example there of shchita, of slaughtering an animal. So there's a reason for the mitzvah, but the nitty-gritty details, he says, such as the precise place where to slaughter the animal, the trachea and the esophagus, don't follow the same reasoning, right? In other words, all of the details they're important towards the mitzvah, but not necessarily they're a part and parcel of the reasoning of the mitzvah, is what the Rambam is saying. Now that's what he's saying over here, and not necessarily that's what he actually understands elsewhere, which is another topic for discussion, but not for now. But what comes out of this perspective is that the details will become very tedious, because it's difficult to enjoy the details of something if they don't support the core mitzvah, right? In other words, if the basic idea of the tefillin is, for example, I'm giving that as an example, right? The binding of the mind and the heart. So whether some of the strap is turned over, or whether the yud is not on the house on the house itself. So okay, you should do that, but it doesn't take away from the general character of the mitzvah, because that detail isn't necessarily crucial to the overall reaching character and the theme or the idea of the mitzvah, the reasoning of the mitzvah, right? So therefore, according to this, and it'd be very difficult, all the details, it would be very tedious because it's not so important. That's the way the Rambam says here in the Guide to Perplex, and I'm telling you that that's not necessarily the way he sees it in halacha, because here he's speaking to a different mindset. So he's giving that possibility of how to see it. I would suggest he doesn't see that this way elsewhere. Because he wrote the Guide for the Perplexed for people who are perplexed in his day, that there were a lot of people who were following the ways of Greek philosophy, and so he tried to speak to them with their rationale. But the Hasidic masters have a different viewpoint of this, that they argue that details matter. Every detail matters because it's part of the divine will. Let's explain what that means exactly. So this is from the Rebbe Rashab, fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, previous Rebbe's father. God desires that we fulfill a mitzvah at a deep, absolute level. In other words, what does that mean? God is entirely invested, so to speak, in his desire for us to fulfill the mitzvahs. This will exist independently, entirely one-sided. As such, this will is not subject to change or expiration. Rather, it is absolute and eternal. What then did the sages mean when they stated, what does God care where precisely the location of the slaughter takes place? Right? And which is the Rambam, what he quoted, what we quoted from the Rambam before. So if the will invested in a mitzvah is God's deep-seated desire, of course he cares. So then why do the sages say, well, it matters to God if you slaughter this way, you slaughter that way? So the answer is, our sage's statement is only on the external utilitarian level. However, at the deep absolute, the one-sided level, so to speak, God most certainly does care. After all, a mitzvah is a manifestation of God's deepest one-sided desire. And in that state, God wishes that the mitzvah be performed in a specific way, regardless of anything or anyone else, period. As such, only when performed with precision does it reflect God's true will. So the Rebbe spells this out more clearly. What does it mean? Tiny details are part of the absolute one-sided desire of God. In other words, even the tiniest details of a mitzvah are part of this one-sided absolute desire, reflective of God's true absolute nature. What does this mean? What does this mean? Why does God want tefillin? Why does he want kosher? What does it mean, an absolute one-sided desire? He didn't look at me and you and say, you know, these people, I think they need kosher, so it'll be good for them. I think they need tefillin, you know, because that will keep them in line. I think they need the Sabbath, so they have a day of resting, and so on and so forth. No, has nothing to do with me and you. It's his desire. Why? Just because that's what he wants. Why does he want it? Because he wants it. Not because of me, not because of the Jewish people. Oh, you know, I've got a Jewish people, you know, let me keep them busy with something that's going to have means to an end, that has value, that will have something valuable in their life. You know, they'll have meaning in their life. And let me give them something, you know, let me give them the Sabbath. Let me give them a kosher, you know, so they'll learn how to, you know, how to sanctify food. Let me give them, and you know why he wants it? It's an absolute one-sided desire because it's reflective of him. It's not about me and you. Yes, he gave it to me and you to fulfill, but what he gave us is an expression of him for you and I to connect to. So the reasons and the benefits for a mitzvah are only secondary to the primary point. The primary point is that a mitzvah is an expression of the divine will. Is this only of the overall mitzvah? No. It's even in the most minute detail. That minute detail is an expression of the absolute will of God. So when we fulfill it, we are connecting to the absolute will of God that is an expression of him, what he wants. Why does he want it? If there was a reason why he wanted it, you know, you need the Sabbath because you're a workaholic. Okay, you guys, I know what you Jews are going to be, workaholics. So I'm going to give you the Sabbath so you don't become workaholics. But then what happens if someone's not a workaholic? So they don't really need the Sabbath because it's based on a reason. It's not absolute. So God didn't give us the Sabbath as a, you know, to fulfill something, a need that we might have, right? He didn't give us kosher in order that, you know, we should learn self-restraint. You know, what do you teach a child when at the youngest age? How do you teach them self-restraint? With food, because that's what they engage in, is in food at a young age, right? When a little child throws the food from the table, you teach them nicely that they shouldn't do such a thing, right? You're teaching them self-restraint. So God gave us the mitzvah of kosher. Oh, you can say for self-restraint. Yeah, but you know what? I fast so often. What's the difference? You know, I have such self-restraint. You know, I don't need that mitzvah. And even if I'm doing it, if it's about self-restraint, and then I'm going to be committed to it as much as it's going to bring me the value of self-restraint. And if it won't give me that value, then I'm not going to be so committed to it. So you know why we should be committed to it? Because it's the absolute will of God. Why? It's absolute. Absolute is, there's no why. This is what he wants, which this is a very difficult thing to wrap our minds around, because usually the things we want are utilitarian. They serve a purpose, right? They serve a purpose. Here we're saying, no, they're not to serve a purpose. They are an expression, not that they don't have a purpose and they can serve a purpose, but that's not the deepest level of a mitzvah. The utilitarian value of a mitzvah is the means to an end. Is there utilitarian value? Yes. But there's a deeper will that you want this absolutely. Just like if you want God for utilitarian purposes, you can only want him as much as but you want God because he's God. And you want absolutely. If you want your child because there's a utilitarian value to your child, right? That, when the utilitarian value is gone, you're not going to be, and even when it's not gone, you're not so devoted. It's not absolute. It's not absolute. How could it be absolute? Because we have a part of God in us, and God, he himself is absolute in his desire that this is what he wants. So we have that capability too, even though for the most part, we don't live that kind of life. We live a utilitarian life, a means to an end. But this is, God wants a mitzvah absolutely. Why? Because it's an expression of him. It's an expression of him. Therefore, he desires it. How's that an expression of him? Oh, well, that's why we learn a lot of Tanya and Chassidus, and we can understand how each mitzvah is an expression of him. So now we can understand the innovation of the Torah portion is that its general rules and finer details were set at Sinai. Why? Now we understand why the details were set at Sinai and why this is important. Even the details in the minutiae associated only with how to carry out the mitzvah. In other words, the utilitarian manner and how to do the mitzvah, the pragmatic way to do the mitzvah. They too are part of a real mitzvah, namely the deep one-sided godly desire. Thus, they too were stated at Sinai, one-sided godly overture. Wow. So, why at Sinai? To tell me that not just the general themes are what God wants, but the details, and every detail, are an expression of his divine will. In what manner is an expression of it? In absolute terms. He doesn't want it for utilitarian purposes. He wants it because it's an expression of him. With this now we can understand why Shemitah was chosen as the vehicle to bring out this message. Think about it. Were the Jews 40 years in a desert? Did they own any land? No. Is this mitzvah applicable? Absolutely not. When will it be applicable? After 40 years they come into the land. Immediately will it be applicable? No. They first have to battle and they have to conquer the land, and then they have to divvy out the land. Then Truma and Meiser will be applicable then, once they have the land. But is sabbatical year applicable then? No, only 7 years later. So why in the desert are they being told this mitzvah? There's no application for it until 21 years after they're in the land of Israel, because it took 7 years to conquer, 7 years to divvy up the land, and then they started counting the sabbatical year after 14 years, so then another 7 years was the sabbatical year. So it's the last thing that has any practical value that should be told. So why is it being told? Well, if it's only being told for its practical value, then it wouldn't be told. Then you wait for it when you need to know how to practice this. It's being told, not just the major theme, but all of the minutiae, the details were told at Sinai to tell you that not just the major theme, but even the finer details that are not practical at all now, but they're an expression of the inner will of God. They're an expression of the inner will of God. And therefore, by knowing it, even though you're not going to fulfill it, right? By knowing it, what are you knowing? The inner will of God, what he really wants. I can't practically do it now, but that's not relevant. That's okay. But I'm understanding and having an attachment to God and what he really wants. And what does he want? He wants that not just the general principle of a mitzvah, but its finer details are an expression of his inner will, of what he really wants. Absolutely. Now, he doesn't want it like, tefillin, the strap turns over, right? Or the strap is turned over on the head over here. So I go over and I check people, the tefillin is too low over here. What's the big deal? Come on, Or someone's wearing a tallis and it's like a scarf, it's not the right size. Or the tzitzis aren't proper. What's the big deal? I mean, listen, he's praying, he's getting into it. Why do you make a big deal? Well, it is a big deal. Because that's not expressing the inner will of God. And therefore, there's no attachment to that inner will of God. Maybe for pragmatic purposes or utilitarian value, maybe it makes him feel good and maybe he prays really well with that scarf. Some people have a tallis this big, right? It's a scarf, it's not a tallis. A tallis has to cover most of your body, or potentially at least. So what's a big deal? Because that's what God wants. That's what makes it a big deal. Yeah, come on, but he really cares if it's this size or that size. Yeah. Well, why? Why would he care? Because it's an expression of him. It matters to him absolutely. It doesn't matter to him somewhat. Maybe to me and you, it will be somewhat, important to us. And the more we learn, the more we, devote ourselves, so it'll be even more. But to God, it's absolute of value and importance. Again, not because of the utilitarian value, because that's not absolute, but because it's an expression of him, his will, what he wants. Whoa, that's heavy. So therefore, when I do a mitzvah, when in its finer details, and a mitzvah is not just a commandment of God, as we've learned so many times, it's the word connection, safsa v'chibur. It means a bonding, a connection with God. In the finer details, that's where I get the connection. Why? Just because that's how he wants it. If he was, one of the seven on the, the High Supreme Court judicial, making judicial decisions, so you need a reason for everything. You need to, the judgment needs to be rendered with proper reasoning. Otherwise, it's not going to be accepted. That's true. That's when it's of a human quality, it's utilitarian. But when it comes from God, right, this is what he wants. So Shemitah represents that because it is the least practical of all the mitzvahs in the Torah, because it will not be observed. It'll be the last mitzvah that's observed by the Jewish people when they come to the land of Israel. Only after 7 years that they already did Truma, Meiser, and tithing and all that stuff, right? Which they already did. So it becomes the least practical, it's the least utilitarian to be taught at Sinai. And not only is it taught at Sinai, the general principle, but all of its finer details. Because in the finer details, right? In the finer details, right, is it what comes out is the devil's not in the details. God is in the details. God is in the details. How so? Because that's what he wants. Why? Well, he's God. He's absolute. He's infinite. How much does he want it? Absolutely, infinitely. Not some measured amount, right? And therefore it's eternal. It doesn't change. It doesn't change. That's a very powerful idea. So, when we think about doing any mitzvah and we engage in it, that's why we have to learn to know what are the details of the mitzvah. So then when we do it, we'll have actually a pleasure in the details, because in the details, that's where God's found. Because that's an expression of him, what he really wants. Why does he want it? Because it's of him. How's that? If I would know, I would be. And that's what it is. Any questions? This was very abstract, but very powerful. Need more conversation in the because again, how many things do we do absolutely out of absolute conviction, not for utilitarian value? Even what you do for your spouse sometimes is not absolute. It's utilitarian. Let me keep her happy, Let me do for him so he will, right? So he'll, that's utilitarian. Mitzvah is an opportunity that we can rise beyond the human condition and devote ourselves to connect to Hashem, as this is what he wants. This is an expression of him, and I have an attachment to him, his divine will that is of him. Davida, go ahead.
What about the mitzvahs of the Hulk? I mean,
Of the what?
The Hulk. Sorry. I'm sorry. I have a bad connection here. Sorry. The mitzvahs with the Hulk that the ones that we don't know about, that we just do.
Hulk.
Yes. Is that the same thing? I mean, should we be feeling the same way?
So, Hulk means statutory laws like the law of the red heifer, kosher, right? So actually, then it comes, every mitzvah becomes, and it is this way, right? In other words, it's in the details. The devil's not in the detail. God is in the detail. God is in that detail. Why? Because he absolutely wants that. So, what in a sense, that's a chok. Because why does he want it? Just because. In other words, even though Shabbos, listen, anybody observe Shabbos, we definitely feel and sense the great value of Shabbos, like what it does for us, right? And that's all utilitarian. It's not to say that there isn't a utilitarian value. Of course there is. Shabbos should come and you should feel rejuvenated, right? So, but what happens if you're not rejuvenated? So therefore what? Shabbos wasn't Shabbos? Well, maybe it wasn't, maybe you didn't do it in its proper details. That's why it wasn't rejuvenating, because if you did it in its details, it probably would be rejuvenating. That's probably the case. But what happens if it wasn't? So then I might not be committed to it because it's only utilitarian. Or even if I am committed, I'm going through the motions. And unfortunately, I know a lot of people keep Shabbos and they're going through the motions. They're talking about, Hollywood. They're talking about the latest, things in, they're not talking necessarily Torah or talking, words of inspiration, but, so you're going through the motions. You're keeping it, but, your head's elsewhere because it's utilitarian. Because the details are not, you're not finding God. Maybe not in the general, and not in the general, yeah, but in the details, For me, that's the devil. That's Christianity, not Judaism. God is in those details. So we need to find him there. That's the idea here. So in that sense, every mitzvah is a chok, is a statutory law that's beyond, because it's an expression of the inner will of God. Now, some things have also an outer will of God that express, reason, value, utilitarian value, and so on. But what we need to be careful is not get lost there, because that's not what it is. Because then it's not divine. Then the mitzvah is not really divine. It's just a means to get something for you in your life. More tranquility, more peace. So you have Shabbos, more to be refined in individuals. So you have the Sirus Eimer, so you can refine yourself. But that's not what that's there's a truth to all that, but it's first and foremost an expression of the divine will, and therefore my attachment to it, I'm connecting to the inner will of God, to God himself, as opposed to the utilitarian quality of God, so to speak, as it were.
Rabbi,
Yes, Andrew.
is that the reason, or when we read the Torah, and there's a couple that I'm sure that it's being read properly, I don't know if it's the Gabbai, but in any event,
Right.
if they correct the person that's reading, is that because that word is the way that it's been given by God, and if it's improper, we're not fulfilling reading the Torah even for that one syllable that might be off?
So actually, that idea brings it across. Yes, and here it's also to preserve the integrity of the Torah. Can you imagine if after every year you were hearing it wrong because it was read wrong? So there could be a lot of fallout from that. But ultimately, it's because it's an expression of the divine will and wisdom of God. So you want to make sure that it is appropriately read. Yeah, absolutely. Good point. All right, folks. Amazing. I'll see some of you soon. All right. A good tavach. Be well, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.